Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Skinwalker in the Shadows of the Desert. Jake had always prided himself on being a seasoned hiker. He was no stranger to the wild. He'd trekked through forests, climbed mountains, and camped alone in places most people wouldn't dare to go. But that night, in the remote desert of New Mexico, something felt different. The air was crisp with autumn's chill, and the stars hung heavy in the sky, twinkling like a sea of cold eyes above him. He'd set up camp in a quiet valley, the vast desert stretching out in all directions. The silence was deafening, a kind of stillness that seemed to press in on him from every angle. Jake had grown accustomed to the eerie quiet of the wilderness, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't the normal hum of nature. It felt oppressive, like the land itself was holding its breath. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake started a small fire to ward off the growing cold. The flames crackled and hissed, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch beyond the reach of the firelight. He sat back, adjusting his pack behind him as he took a sip from his water bottle, eyes scanning the landscape for any movement. There was something hypnotic about the way the desert seemed to shift as the night deepened. But then the wind stopped. Completely. There wasn't even the faintest rustle of a leaf or the sound of sand shifting in the breeze. Jake's unease began to settle in. It was too quiet. Even the desert had a rhythm to it. This was wrong. Then he heard it. A sound so faint at first that Jake thought he was imagining it. A whisper, soft and almost melodic, carried on the still air. He froze, his heart thumping in his chest. He wasn't sure why, but the whisper had sent a shiver up his spine. He turned his head, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. But there was nothing, only the vast emptiness of the desert. "Hello," Jake called out, half expecting it to be another hiker or maybe a lost traveler. His voice cracked the silence, and for a moment, he felt a small measure of comfort. Then the voice came again. This time, it was clearer, unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a trick of his mind. It was a voice, his voice. "Hello," it whispered, mimicking him perfectly, as though it was coming from the air itself. Jake's stomach twisted. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice now trembling slightly. But instead of a response, the voice just repeated him. "Who's there?" it said, a little too perfectly, a little too clearly. It was him, but it wasn't. The inflection was wrong. The tone was slightly off, as though someone was trying too hard to sound like him. Jake stood up, his instincts kicking in. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "Show yourself," he demanded, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife. He kept it aside. But there was no movement in the shadows. No figure, no rustle of sand or brush. The voice kept repeating him, each time with a slight distortion, as though it were growing closer, mimicking his every word but with a sickening edge to it. "Show yourself." Jake's hand tightened around the handle of his knife. He had to remain calm. Then, without warning, his flashlight flickered. The beam sputtered before it went out completely, plunging him into darkness. His heart hammered in his chest. and panic clawed at the edges of his mind. He clicked the flashlight again, his thumb shaking against the switch, and when it finally came back to life, the beam was weak, barely a sliver of light cutting through the desert's darkness. For a moment, there was nothing, just the eerie stillness of the desert night. Then, in the corner of his vision, he saw it, a shadow. It was moving, slinking across the sand like it was something alive, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He spun around, shining the flashlight toward the movement, but when the light hit, there was nothing. Only empty desert stretching endlessly in every direction. Then, from the edge of the beam, he saw it again, closer this time. The shadow moved in jerky, unnatural steps, as though it were fighting against the very laws of nature. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The shape was wrong, its proportions off, like it had been twisted into something grotesque. It resembled a man, but it wasn't a man. The limbs were too long, too thin, stretching in ways that weren't possible. It was like looking at something that was trying to be human, but couldn't quite get it right. Jake's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he thought he might scream. But then, before he could react, the figure darted forward. Fast, faster than any human could move. The light caught its glowing eyes, eyes that gleamed with an unnatural yellow-green hue. And then, just like that, it vanished. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. A suffocating kind. The kind that feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jake's mind raced. What had he seen? What was that thing? He didn't know, but he knew one thing for sure. It wasn't a person. And it wasn't anything he wanted to find out more about. He packed his things quickly, trembling with every movement. His hands were slick with sweat, his breath shallow. He couldn't get out of there fast enough. The desert had never felt so big, so suffocating. As he stumbled over the rough terrain, he swore he could hear it again, the voice, his voice, calling to him from the shadows. It wasn't until years later, long after he'd left the desert behind, that Jake learned of the Skinwalker legends. The stories of shape-shifting witches who could mimic voices, who could transform into animals, or even worse, into something that looked like a person, but wasn't. Jake never returned to that valley. Every time he thought about it, his skin crawled. The memory of the shadow, of the glowing eyes, of the voice that wasn't his own. Those things never left him. And every time the wind howled through the trees at night, or the shadows seemed to stretch a little too far, Jake couldn't help but wonder if the thing in the desert was still out there, waiting for the next fool to wander into its domain. Waiting for him. Story 2. The Skinwalker in the old family cabin. Emily had always cherished the summer she spent at her grandparents' cabin nestled deep in the mountains. The old wood creaked and groaned under the weight of history, but the place had a kind of charm that no other house could match. Surrounded by towering pines and the hum of the wilderness, it was the perfect escape from the chaos of city life. And every winter, she'd return, drawn to the quiet isolation that the snow brought. But this time was different. The cabin, once warm and inviting, now felt cold in ways she couldn't explain. It started with a strange feeling that clung to the walls, like a thick fog that wouldn't lift no matter how much the fire crackled in the hearth. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and every creak of the old wooden beams seemed to echo in the empty spaces of her mind. It wasn't the usual peaceful quiet of the mountains. There was something lurking beneath the surface, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand at attention. Emily tried to shake off the feeling. After all, she'd been coming here for years, and the cabin had always been a safe haven. But no matter how much she told herself that, the unease didn't go away. It followed her through the house, pressing in from every corner, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating fog. That night, the storm came in hard. The wind howled outside, whipping the snow into a blinding frenzy. The heavy snowflakes pummeled the windows, and the storm seemed to be trying to break through the fragile glass. It was the kind of night where the world felt as if it had been swallowed up by the storm. Emily, tucked under a thick blanket by the fire, stared into the flames, her thoughts drifting aimlessly. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the room, until something else caught her attention. Soft footsteps. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the quiet shuffle of someone walking on snow. But there was no one else here. Her grandparents were fast asleep in the room down the hall, and she was alone. Or so she thought. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The sound was unmistakable now. Someone or something was walking outside, right outside the window. Emily held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribcage. She couldn't see anything through the snow, not with the storm so fierce, but the footsteps were growing nearer, circling the cabin like a predator. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize what she was hearing. Maybe it was an animal, some deer or elk shuffling around in the snow. But the way the steps moved, it didn't feel like an animal. It felt too deliberate, too purposeful. Emily's pulse quickened. Then came the voice. Low, guttural, a whisper that seemed to scrape at her very soul. It came through the cracks in the cabin's walls, a sound that chilled her to the bone. Emily, Emily. The voice was unmistakable. It was her name, drawn out in a way that made her skin crawl. It wasn't a normal voice. It was distorted, like it had been filtered through something ancient and unnatural. And yet it sounded so familiar, so intimate. Her body froze. The hairs on her arms stood at attention, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, cautiously, she moved toward the window, the floorboards creaking under her weight. Her heart was pounding now, a relentless thud in her ears. She peered out the window into the storm. The visibility was near zero, the snow swirling in violent gusts. But then, in the distance, just beyond the tree line, she saw it. A figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it stood motionless, a shadow against the swirling snow. The storm obscured its features, but she could make out enough to know that something was wrong. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and they bent at odd angles like a twisted marionette. Its body seemed to shift unnaturally in the shadows, like it was made of something other than flesh and bone. But what truly sent a wave of terror crashing through her was its eyes. They glowed in the darkness, yellow and unblinking, locked onto her with an intensity that made her feel like prey. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, and Emily couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. It was as if the world had come to a standstill, and all that existed was her, the thing outside, and the oppressive weight of the storm. Then the figure moved. It didn't walk like a person. It didn't even move like an animal. It was more like a nightmare made flesh, its body twisting and jerking in unnatural ways as it stepped closer, closer to the cabin. Emily's heart raced. She couldn't move. Her feet felt glued to the floor, her body frozen with terror. She tore her gaze away from the window and ran to her grandparents' room. Her breath came in quick gasps, her heart hammering in her chest. She threw open the door and rushed inside, waking her grandfather with a start. "Grandpa," she cried, her voice frantic. "There's something out there. I saw it. It's outside." Her grandfather, bleary-eyed and confused, looked at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. But when he saw the look in her eyes, the raw terror, his expression shifted. He sat up in bed, his face hardening as if a dark cloud had descended on him. "You saw it, didn't you?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. His voice was low, gravelly, like a man who'd known too much sorrow. "I told you never to go outside after dark." Emily shook her head, trying to make sense of the panic surging through her. What was that? What was out there? It had eyes, glowing eyes. It was a human. Her grandfather's face grew pale, and he reached for the lantern by his bedside, lighting it with trembling hands. "It's a Skinwalker, child, a shapeshifter, a creature from the old ways. It's not something you should ever face. A Skinwalker," Emily whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. Her grandfather nodded gravely. "They were once human, but they traded their souls for power. They can take any shape, any form they want. Mimic voices wear the skin of animals, even people. They prey on those who wander alone, especially on nights like this." The wind howled outside, the snow now pounding against the cabin like a living thing. Emily looked back to the window, but the figure was gone. Yet the feeling remained, the oppressive presence, the weight of something ancient and hungry still lingered in the room. Her grandfather's voice cut through the silence, low and steady. "You never return to the cabin alone again. You never step foot outside after dark. Not unless you wanted to follow you home." Emily sat in stunned silence, the reality of what she had witnessed settling over her like a suffocating fog. The storm raged on outside, but it was the storm inside her mind that would haunt her long after the snow had melted. That night, she stayed huddled in her grandparents' room, too terrified to sleep. The Skinwalker had come too close for comfort, and she knew, deep down, that it would never truly leave her. It had marked her, and its shadow would follow her for the rest of her life. She never returned to that cabin again. Story 3. The Skinwalker that followed me home. David had always prided himself on being a man of reason, a no-nonsense guy who believed only in what could be seen and measured. Ghost stories, supernatural creatures, old folklore. He dismissed them all as the ramblings of people too eager to believe in the unknown. That is, until one hot afternoon in the Arizona desert, when a routine road trip took a turn he never could have imagined. It started like any other summer road trip. David, alone in his car, the wind whipping through the cracked windows as he sped across the highway. His destination wasn't important. He was just looking to clear his mind. A detour through the desert seemed like a good way to stretch his legs and get some fresh air. He had always liked the solitude of wide open spaces, the way the land stretched on forever, feeling like it could swallow him whole if it wanted to. He pulled off the highway, the tires crunching against the dirt road as he left the paved world behind. The landscape was vast and desolate, the sun burning down on the cracked earth. There was nothing but dust, scrub, and the occasional tumbleweed rolling by. It was peaceful in a way, almost too peaceful, but David didn't mind. He was used to being alone with his thoughts, far away from the distractions of city life. He set out on foot, walking deeper into the desert, the dry heat pressing against his skin. It wasn't long before he noticed a figure. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the heat, a mirage, maybe. In the distance, just at the edge of some jagged rocks, he could make out the silhouette of a person, a man, or at least he thought it was. The figure was dressed in ragged clothes, and though David couldn't make out any details, there was something about the way it stood there, motionless, as if watching him, that felt wrong. David, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off. Probably just another hiker, he muttered to himself. He waved, expecting a friendly acknowledgement in return, but the figure didn't move. It didn't even flinch. Instead, it just stood there, its outline dark against the fading light of the afternoon sun. David hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "Just my mind playing tricks on me," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. He turned his back on the figure and continued walking, determined to enjoy the peace and quiet. But as he moved further into the desert, he began to feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't the heat. It wasn't the silence. It was something else, something deeper, an unsettling feeling that prickled beneath his skin as if he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder. The figure was still there, standing at the edge of the rocks, unmoving. But now, it seemed a little closer. No, not closer, just more present, more real. David quickened his pace, but when he looked back again, the figure had moved. Not in a rush, not with any sudden movement, but it had crossed the distance, just enough to stay out of sight whenever David turned to look. It was almost like the thing was pacing him, matching his steps with slow, deliberate movements. A knot of unease twisted in David's stomach. "It's just a coincidence," he muttered, trying to shake off the feeling. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Something was following him, not just physically, but something more. As the sun began to set, the sky turning into shades of purple and orange, David realized he had wandered far from his car. The desert had a way of swallowing up time, and now he was losing the light. He turned back, hoping to retrace his steps and make it back before darkness fell. But as the shadows stretched longer and the wind picked up, he heard it. Footsteps behind him, faint but unmistakable. His heart raced. His breath came faster. He glanced over his shoulder, but the figure wasn't there. He felt the tightness in his chest, the panic beginning to rise. He wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps were there, but now they were closer, more distinct. Closer than before. Closer than could possibly be. And then David saw it, a shadow in the fading light, moving too fast, too unnaturally. The figure stood right in front of him, blocking his path. But it wasn't human. The thing in front of him wasn't a man at all. It was something else. Its face was twisted and hollow, the skin pulled tight over its bones, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow, like the light of a dying flame. Its body was contorted in unnatural ways, as if its joints had been reversed, its arms long and spindly, ending in fingers too long to be human. David's breath caught in his throat, and for the first time in his life, the skeptic in him couldn't deny what was happening. This was real. The legends, the stories, this thing, this creature was no myth. Before he could move, the thing let out a low, guttural growl. It was a sound that didn't belong to any living thing, something deep and primal. The ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble as the creature took a step forward, its eyes locking onto him. David turned and ran. His feet pounded against the desert ground, the dust kicking up in a frenzy behind him. His mind raced, his thoughts a blur, but one thing was clear. He had to get away. He had to make it back to his car. He couldn't stop. Not now. His lungs burned. His legs screamed for mercy, but he kept running. Every step felt like the weight of the world, but the footsteps behind him were louder, closer. Something was right there, breathing down his neck. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, David saw the outline of his car in the distance. He pushed himself harder, his breath ragged, his heart hammering in his chest. When he reached the car, he slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. He didn't dare look back. The creature was gone, but David knew it hadn't disappeared. It was still out there somewhere in the desert night, watching. The next morning, after barely sleeping a wink, David left the desert behind, but the fear remained. He researched the desert, the strange figure, and the stories of the Navajo people. That's when he learned about Skinwalkers, shape-shifting creatures that could mimic human forms, stalking their victims, following them home. David had unknowingly crossed paths with one that night, and it had followed him, not just through the desert, but home, into his mind, into his nightmares. And every now and then, when he's alone, he hears those footsteps again, faint but unmistakable, always following, always waiting. David wasn't just lost in the desert that night. He had narrowly escaped something far worse.